My name is Jerry Dilger, and I've been a parishioner here at St. Joe's. Actually, since we moved back to Cedar Rapids, Marion area in 1990. The story that I want to share with you is this. I grew up in Maywood, Illinois, a suburb west of Chicago, about 6 or 8 miles. I wound up attending St. Eulalia grade school, beginning in kindergarten through 8th grade. While I was at St. Eulalia, I was a choir boy, I was an altar boy, and a safety guard, which was kind of a 7th and 8th grade situation where we help little kids cross the busy street. In most of those years that I was in grade school, we were close enough to walk to school. It was only about 3 blocks or so. So I would walk to school in the morning, and I'd be able to come back home for lunch during the lunch break, and then back to school in the afternoon. My mom was not working outside of the home, so she was a pretty big influence on my early life. Obviously, she was Catholic, so was my dad, so I consider myself a Catholic from cradle on. When we vacationed, my father qualified for 2 weeks of vacation. We usually did it in August of each year, partly because it was after the Little League season was over. But we would go to places, as I remember, Florida, Washington, D.C., Yellowstone, and we always enjoyed going. And I had a brother, there was 2 of us, and normally vacation was important because it gave us the chance to stay at a hotel and swim in a pool. So we were always up and ready to do that. After graduating from grade school at St. Eulalia, I opted to go to a St. Joseph High School in Westchester, Illinois. It was a relatively new Catholic high school, 1,600 boys, taught by the Christian Brothers. So there was a little more chaos there than I had remember having in grade school. And with no girls being in the school, it was also a little bit physical, both from a student standpoint and the Christian Brothers. But they did what they had to do to deal with 1,600 boys. After their first year of high school, freshman year, that August, we had been talking about making plans to go on our normal vacation. This particular year, we were planning on heading down to Texas. About a week or 10 days before we were leaving, I was starting to feel, and I wasn't sure how to explain it, and I didn't explain it, but I was starting to feel like we shouldn't go. But I never verbalized it to my mom and dad. I just couldn't quite figure it out. The day we were leaving was August 10th. It was a Saturday morning. And I can remember standing at the trunk of the car loading the suitcase when it was the first time that I mentioned to my mom and dad that I didn't feel like we should be going. And of course, at 14 years old, and a brother who was ready to go, I couldn't explain why. So in the car we jumped and we drove down through Illinois, headed through St. Louis, and later that afternoon, we arrived in Rolla, Missouri, where we stayed overnight. I can remember waking up the next morning, my mom waking me up. She had located a local Catholic church, and the time of Mass was 9 o'clock. And she was a stickler for going to church on Sunday. So I grew up with that mentality that this is what we did. And so we went to church that morning, and 10 o'clock we were done. We went back over to the hotel, loaded up the car, checked out, and then I remember my mom saying to my dad that she'd start out driving, basically because he had driven all day Saturday. So we got going about 10:30, and we were heading towards Springfield, Missouri. We'd been in the car about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. We had now gone through Springfield, and we were heading into a town or an area called Halltown, Missouri. We were involved at that time in a car accident with 2 other vehicles. 5 people died in that accident. 5 people were injured. 3 of the people that died were my parents and my brother. The last thing that I remember sitting in the back seat of the car before the impact was my dad yelling out, "Take the ditch." However, there wasn't time to do that, and we were hit head on, and everything went black for me. I was thrown from the car across the highway to the opposite side of the road, and I don't know how long I was out. I remember waking up, laying on my back with people standing over me, trying to keep the sun out of my face because it was an August 90-degree day and it was hot. My forehead and nose, I was cut open and bleeding, so it was very difficult to see through the blood in my eyes. So I don't know exactly how from the highway I was, but I was a distance. Pretty soon I heard the sirens, ambulances, police cars, and I remember, the people from the ambulance coming. They were able to load me on a stretcher and took me over and put me in the back of an ambulance. And, I remember heading off for the hospital, which was back in Springfield, so it was only 6 or 8 miles. I remember being carried into the emergency room, again surrounded by 3 or 4 nurses and physicians who put me on a table and did what they could to start cleaning up the blood, checking out what basically had happened to me. And I remember being awake and watching them stitch my forehead, my nose, and my lip that had been split open in the accident. I don't remember much of the rest of that day. I'm sure that I was, asleep, knocked out, and I went to a room. I kind of woke up the next morning, and I remember asking one of the nurses about my parents. And basically the answer I got from her was that they had taken them to another hospital. And actually I accepted that at the time. I was there another night, and I think it was on Tuesday. They wound up moving me to a room with another young man. I'd say he was 2 or 3 years older than I was, so he was maybe 16 or 17. And it was at that time, because he had either seen the information on TV or in a newspaper, it was at that time that I learned from him that my parents and brother had died in the accident. And I can remember thinking, how could that happen to me at this point? So, I was there alone. I did some praying, but it was very, very difficult to accept that could have been a possibility. On Thursday of that week, I was in the hospital 3 or 4 days. They put an arm in a cast, and there were some other things that they had to heal and wrap and bandage. But by and large, I wasn't really seriously hurt. Scarred up, stitched up in a few places, but no long-term disabilities were going to be a result of the accident, as hard as that was for me to believe, based on pictures that I saw and the fact that so many people died in the accident. On Thursday of that week, my uncle, my mother's brother, who lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, he drove down to Springfield to catch up with me at the hospital. We were able to check out, it was either that day or the next day, and we drove back to Maywood, outside Chicago, where I grew up, to my home. I had an aunt called Aunt May. Everybody needs an Aunt May. But she came over, and she had a daughter who was a nurse. And she came basically every day to change bandages and kind of keep an eye on what was going with some of the scars and things that I had gotten from the accident. The following week, it was a Friday or Saturday, was the funeral. And it was obviously 3 closed caskets. But a good part about it was 3 of my friends that were altar boys with me in grade school served the funeral mass. When the funeral mass was over, we went back to the house, and my uncle and his wife from Cedar Rapids stayed there a couple days with me. And then he said to me he wanted me to come visit them in Cedar Rapids. And I'm thinking he thought at that time that it would be possible that I would be moving in with them. He had 2 boys. One was 2 years older than me, one was 2 years younger. So I fit right in the middle. I really wasn't very familiar with them because they had moved to Iowa from Lake Zurich, Illinois, when I was about 5. And we only would see them maybe once a year around Easter time, when they would come back into the Chicago area and we would get together. I do remember one time when I was younger, I was at their house in Cedar Rapids, so I was a little bit familiar with where they were at, but I know we were only there a day or 2. And so I was there for a few days with them, and we had to return back to Maywood to get back to the house, because obviously he had a lot of things that had to get done there in dealing with attorneys and what was going on with the house and closing things up there. And after the visit at their house in Cedar Rapids, we went back there. And like I said, my Aunt May came over, and we were trying to decide. My uncle wanted me to come to Cedar Rapids, and I actually told him that I thought, since my Aunt May had offered to let me stay with her. Now, she was a widow in her 60s at the time. I was 14, going to be a sophomore in high school. Her husband had passed away, and a few years earlier, and she'd moved into an apartment. So that was going to be the situation if I was going to stay there. I was interested in that because I felt I knew my friends, I knew the school, and I thought this was still okay for me to do. So I stayed with my aunt. I was there about 3 or 4 days. And in about 4 days, I started realizing that this wasn't right for her, and probably wasn't right for me. So I asked her to call my uncle and tell him that I was thinking that I would come out to Cedar Rapids and stay with him. And so she helped me pack up a suitcase full of clothes and drove me downtown to Union Station, which is where the train left from, and I boarded the train in Chicago and took it out. And actually, the train station in Marion Square is where I got off the train and met my aunt and uncle with my suitcase of clothes to move in with them. Later, I found out that he was Catholic also, not practicing. The lady he married was Lutheran, and they really weren't church-going. But after the first time I stayed out there and came back, he had contacted the local Catholic parish, which was St. Pius, and talked to the pastor there, who was Monsignor Sheehy. And basically he was talking to him about what it would take to get me into registered at Regis if I were going to go to high school there. And of course, school had now already started, and but Monsignor Sheehy called over to Regis and kind of had them aware that I might be coming to school. The other thing my uncle did is he always saw to it that I had a ride to and from church on Sunday up at St. Pius. Somebody would drop me off, somebody would pick me up. So I continued to stick with the church. I always went to Mass, knowing that that was something that my mother would want. So school started, and I'd say the toughest part for me was at night, going to sleep. Went on for a few months, reviewing the accident as I remembered it in my mind, and trying to decide how it was fair that our Lord could possibly let that happen, that my family could be there one day and then completely gone the next. And the more that I laid awake at night, the more I started to pray. And I slowly started to come around that this was the Lord's plan, and that I was a small part of a bigger picture. So I went from being sad to angry to starting to move on to the fact that I was lucky to have the 14 years that I had with them, because 14 years was better than no time at all. After 3 years at Regis, I decided on graduation that I was going to go to Loras College up in Dubuque. And I had been working at Eagle Grocery Store in high school out at Lindale. And when I went up to Dubuque, they had called ahead, letting the store manager in Dubuque know that I had been an Eagle employee throughout high school, and that I maybe would be interested in a part-time position. So anyway, I did go into the store, and of course they hired me right away, because I had worked 3 or 4 years of high school and summer in Cedar Rapids with Eagles. And so when I was at Loras, I continued to go to Mass. I really had kind of come to the conclusion that what had happened was out of my control, and that the Lord had other plans looking forward. It wasn't easy dealing with that, but I continued to have faith, say prayers, and was able to work through it. Before my senior year at Loras, while I was working at Eagles, I met my wife. She was a nursing student at Mercy in Dubuque, and she was working at Eagles as a cashier. And I can remember I always took my Hostess cupcakes through her line to check out. Eventually, we started dating, and about a year later, we became engaged. And it was really at that time that I realized that this was a plan that was really beyond my control. So we were married in '72. In '78, we had our son. In '80, in '71, I actually started with Prudential, and that made sense. I was in the insurance industry, and of course, with what happened to me, I had no problem talking to people about the need for life insurance and products like that. So it was kind of a natural fit. So I started with Prudential in 71. That was slightly before we were married. We were married in 72. 78, we had our first son. In 1980, Prudential moved me up to Minneapolis, and we were up there for 2 years. In 1982, Prudential asked me to go over to Saginaw, Michigan, to take a district over there, which was about 50 agents and 10 clericals, so I had about 60 people. But it was really the position that I wanted to get to. So we moved over to Michigan. My son went to Catholic grade school over there, and we were over there about, I'd say, 3 or 4 years when I had a dream one night that for some reason, beyond my understanding, that my son was going to graduate from Regis High School. And I woke up the next day and told my wife, Dory, the dream that I had, that he was going to graduate from Regis. Well, we kind of wrote it off because it didn't seem any reason that we were ever going to be coming back to Iowa at that particular point in time. But there was a point in time coming. It was still a few years down the road. It was in '89 when Prudential came to me and asked me to help out doing some recruiting down in the Detroit area with 3 agencies down there. And so I was doing that. It didn't require a move. I was basically driving down there 2 or 3 days a week to help out. And later that year, Vice President of Marketing asked me to consider taking an agency in Detroit. And I can remember looking at him and saying, I'm an Iowa boy, and you need a Detroit person to be in a Detroit district, because it was a very different world down there, and I just didn't think it was for me. And as a result, they kind of took that to heart, and not skipping over this, in 1985, we also had a second child, a daughter. And this was probably about the time that maybe that I had the dream about my son graduating from Regis. But anyway, to make a long story short, at that point, we had the opportunity to come back to Cedar Rapids. And we did that in '90, and we moved to Marion, and that's when we were a part of St. Joe's. I always considered in high school that I was part of St. Pius, but it was just me going to church over there. So we had moved back, and in 2006, my wife and I were doing a cruise, and we flew over to Barcelona, Spain, and we stayed kind of right in the area down by the port. Actually, we were near the street Ramblas. If you remember, there was a terrorist attack there early on in Barcelona, a number of years ago. And we were in a hotel not too far from that area, and we got in there on a Thursday. The ship was going to be leaving for Naples, Rome, Monte Carlo, Monaco, and Marseille, France on Saturday. So on Friday, we left the hotel and decided we were just going to go for kind of a walk around Barcelona. And we weren't 3 blocks away from the hotel when we walked by St. Eulalia Cathedral, which obviously was my grade school, and the saint that it was named after. And I never knew anything about her, where she was from. I don't remember ever having any of that discussion about St. Eulalia when I was a student in the grade school. As it turned out, she was a 14-year-old martyr of the faith, and when she was 13, the government there had grabbed her off the street and put her in a wine barrel full of nails and glass and rolled her down the government step buildings, which were just a block or block and a half away from where this cathedral was at. And as I remember, there was 60, 80, maybe even 100 steps up to the government building that the story said they rolled her down. And when it got to the bottom and they opened up the wine keg that they had put her in, she came out completely unscratched. And so they did it 2 more times, and with the same result, that she had no marks. And at that particular time, apparently they decided that maybe they should just leave things alone. But apparently the next year, later on, when she was 14 and a half, she was actually martyred for the faith. And she actually is one of 2 patron saints of Barcelona. But I remember when we saw the cathedral on our walk, I can remember thinking this was no accident that we walked by that church. It was, again, part of God's plan. But then again in 2012, our daughter was expecting her first child, and she was due in September of that year. And she'd been having a little bit of a problem. She was under the care of a physician. And of course, my wife being a nurse, on one Friday, and it was actually July 6th, it was a Friday, she called, and she had been swelling up. And my wife, Dory, insisted that she called the doctor and tell them that she needed to be seen that afternoon, which they accommodated her. So she went into the doctor that Friday afternoon. Again, she was due in mid-September. And they checked her out and told her that they were going to put her in the hospital. And I can remember when she got that information, she called us. And she was thinking that she was going to be in the hospital maybe over the weekend. And so we drove up there right away. And actually, we drove up there each and every day for several days. And it got to be Tuesday of that week, and she was still in the hospital. And now they were telling her that she wasn't going to be going home. She didn't quite understand that because she thought the baby wasn't due until July. But they said that you're going to be here till the baby's born. And that was kind of a shock, somewhat to all of us. Excuse me here for a minute. Anyway, we drove back up there on Wednesday. We went home every night back to Cedar Rapids. We drove up there on Wednesday, and she was in a room that was kind of based at a corner of a hallway, so you could get to the room from 2 different directions. And there was a waiting room right across the street from, or right across the hallway from her room. And I would often go over there and just sit down and basically pray that both my daughter and the baby would be healthy. So anyway, later that night, I can remember walking around the hallways. It was a square, and walking around praying. I went back to the waiting room, and I had seen her on and off during the day. And all of a sudden, we heard a call through the hallway, and basically nurses and doctors came running from all directions. My wife was in the room, but it was crowded. I stayed in the waiting room, and I knew that my daughter really would want that. And basically we were being told that they were going to be delivering the baby because of the stress that the instruments were telling them the baby was under. And so anyway, that evening, now it was the 11th, so it was on a Wednesday late in the evening, so she'd been in the hospital 5 days and was about to deliver this baby about 10 or 11 weeks early. And so they delivered the baby, and I remember going in there right after the baby was born and thinking, boy, the baby was blue, extremely blue. But they said that was the stress that the baby had been under. And so they took the baby right to the NICU unit and put some tubes in her. And probably 3 or 4 hours, they were indicating that the baby was doing very well. And so was my daughter. So we decided at that point we could drive home. So we did drive home, and it's probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. And my wife Dory went to bed. She fell asleep, and I was a little bit behind her. I had been sitting out in the living room praying a little bit, and I decided that it was time to get to bed too, because we'd be going back up there the next day. So I remember getting in bed, and I know I wasn't asleep, but I was kind of reviewing what had happened at the hospital. And I can't explain this. It wasn't a dream. It was a vision. I saw my mom in the room, and I thought, oh, I better tell her, what had happened at the hospital. So I started to tell her that she had a granddaughter, and I remember her saying to me, "I know, I was there." And I remember thinking, okay, that makes sense. My mom's name was Elizabeth. My granddaughter was Riley Elizabeth. And I eventually fell asleep. I woke up the next morning, told Dory, my wife, the vision I had, and what had happened, and that my mom had told me that she was there at the hospital. And it was a Covenant in Waterloo. And that really solidified in my mind that the whole car accident, everything was the Lord's plan for me and my family, and that I could accept going forward that I would follow the Catholic faith and continue as I had been, and I thank God for the strength that He had given me to work through the situation from 14 on. And that's really my story from my perspective. Thank you.
Well, I don't know how to say thank you other than thank you for sharing that story with us. I'm sitting over there behind the camera, wiping the tears away. But
well, I really haven't shared the story with anybody. My wife, and my kids, and really that was it. When my wife mentioned that you had said something to her, I think she came to me and said, maybe you should consider this. And based on the good fortune that we've had since, I really decided that, yes, it was the right thing for me to do and to share my beliefs. And if there are people out there who are concerned or depressed or whatever, my suggestion it would be that they pray, because the Lord does have a plan for them.
Thank you. That's a very helpful message, I think, for a lot of people. And I'm grateful. I've been asking people to share their story, and I remember when I asked Dory if they would consider, she's like, "You need to talk to my husband." So that was my experience. So I'm glad that you were willing to share your story.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to be so emotional. I actually did better maybe than I thought I would, but I was glad to do it. Thank you.
Thank you. So now it's up to you. If you see Jerry, make sure you give him a big hug. Give this man a big hug. This is an opportunity for us. We're getting to know people. We're getting to hear what God's done, but it's also a doorway. If you've seen Jerry around Mass or around here and you never had the chance to talk to him or haven't in a while, you could say, "Hey, I saw your story," and it just it's a door opener for having a nice conversation, and that helps build community. So I ask you to consider that, and if also you're inspired by how Jerry shared this emotional story with us here today, a very powerful story, maybe you have something you want to share with us as well. So take courage, take his example, and make sure you say hi to him. Thank you for tuning in. God bless you all, and
God bless.
We'll talk to you soon.